Welcome, everybody. Elizabeth Namgyel will be speaking first. She studied and practiced for over 30 years under the guidance of her teacher and husband, Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche. She has a degree in anthropology and Buddhist studies. After 6.5 years of retreat, her teacher asked her to teach. She's also the retreat master at Samten Ling Retreat Center in Crestone. Then we have Ari Goldfield, is a Buddhist teacher, translator, and psychotherapist in private practice. Along with his wife, Rose, Ari co-directs Wisdom Sun, the international Buddhist community founded in 2011. From 1996 to 2009, Ari served as translator, attendant, and general secretary to Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso Rinpoche. Sarah Plazas. Sarah first learned Tibetan to be able to communicate with her Lama. After her 3-year retreat, her Lama wanted Sarah to fill in as a teacher at a small Dharma center in Chicago. One of the job descriptions there would be to translate for lamas that came through. So Sarah weaseled out of that position by going to Nepal to properly study Tibetan. Since 2011, she served as an interpreter, mostly to one Nyingma Lama. She also works on written translation projects under the auspices of that Nyingma Lama in committee with Richard Barron. Gyurme Avertin is with Rigpa. He has been interpreting and translating from Tibetan for the last 15 years in Nepal, India, and Europe.
Good afternoon, everyone. I feel this conference so far has been very heavy on the translator side, and I've been invited as a Dharma teacher. So I think I want to share just a little bit of what that means to me personally. I think I understand some of the responsibilities that comes with guiding people in their practice and so forth, but I've always been more interested in being a student than a teacher, and slightly uncomfortable with that idea. When I was in retreat, I went in to do a 3-year retreat in Crestone, Colorado, and after 3 years, my teacher, Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, asked me if I wanted to either come out and teach or stay in another year. And I got away with that for 3.5 years. He asked me every single year. And after the 6.5 years, I felt that it would have been selfish for me to stay in. My Sangha needed my support, and so I felt an urgency to come out and somehow serve or contribute in some way to my community. So that's how I started to teach. But it was very hard for me to come out of retreat and do that because I was enjoying the kind of inquisitiveness of my own mind. And to me, being a teacher meant I had to be a knower. At least that's what I thought in the beginning. And when I say enjoying the inquisitiveness of my mind, I don't mean that in retreat I just simply sat there and asked myself a lot of conceptual questions, but it was more that, whatever arose, I started to become more curious about my own experience. And I stopped shutting down immediately around my experience, which to me means grasping and rejecting. Because if you're staying in retreat for a long time and you don't learn to question that things might not be exactly what they seem to be, you'll just be completely tortured the whole time. So it's very profound to be in retreat for this very reason. And so when I talk about inquisitiveness or inquiry or curiosity, that's what I mean. And so when I came out, I felt my mind was so, had become somewhat accustomed to this. And the idea of being a knower was really repulsive to me in some level. And when I mean knower, you might understand the word knower. It's like when you're sitting at a dinner table and you're sitting next to a knower. It's the worst thing you could possibly imagine. I don't appreciate that quality of my own mind, and I don't appreciate that quality in others. Whereas, this sense of openness and inquisitiveness to me is like a very protected place for a Dharma practitioner. So I find that inquiry keeps me in the boundary of Dharma, in the boundary of my Dharma practice. And this is a really interesting question for me. It's like, I think I trust myself now that I'm not spitting out or leaving the boundary of the practice, or at least I know when I am. And that sense of being a knower is one of the ways that I can identify this kind of fishy quality in myself. So, as opposed to translation where you're somewhat bound to a text, when you're a Dharma teacher, you have to open things up, and things can get kind of, I don't want to say creative because I feel so much allegiance to the path of the Dharma and to my teacher and to the instructions and all of that, but it can really open in the most beautiful way. But I always am so careful to watch my mind, in this way, and feel so. I often teach the teachings on Pratitya Samutpada, which is some of my favorite teaching of the middle way, with these 3 sticks. You know how Chandrakirti taught in the text, where you hold up one stick and it's not, the size of the stick is dependent on the size of the other stick. And it shows that the characteristics of anything is not inherent in the object itself. And often when I teach with those sticks, I'm always holding on to them, I notice, because I want to feel so connected to my lineage and my teacher and to the Dharma, scriptural Dharma too. So this is a kind of a question that comes up for me, though, this idea of creativity, but also needing to feel close to the scriptural Dharma. The 2 things I feel that I see as I teach, the 2 kind of pitfalls, and also in my own mind, are, and this is falling out of that place of inquiry, is when you start to reject the Dharma and reject ideas, and you try to make a Dharma that's comfortable for yourself, which is not a place. If you start to kind of customize your own path, customize your own spirituality, it's not going to work. It won't have a transformative effect. And so I feel in this culture there's that danger of rejecting ideas because they're not comfortable. And I even think, sometimes we read not translations, the original text, there are cultural things that are not comfortable to us, but I don't think we have to reject those. I think that the open questioning is a very safe way to investigate, because anything can be investigated within the context of the Dharma, if the mind is poised in this particular way. So there's that extreme, and then there's extreme of grasping on to the Dharma rigidly with the belief systems. And personally, that is often referred to as traditional Dharma, but I don't think that's traditional Dharma. When I think of the great Arya Nagarjuna, he said, "I prostrate to he who has abandoned all views." This is a very powerful quote for me personally. And he's speaking of the Buddha. So when we speak of views, we're not just talking about philosophical views, although those are included, but we're also talking about these subtle sense of is and is not. Nihilism and eternalism, the extremes. So I prostrate to he who has abandoned all views, which is a very powerful statement. So, we have the scriptural Dharma. We've been talking about this a lot in the past couple days, and thanks to you all, there's these incredible translations and root texts and instructions and all of that. And when I think of the texts and the teachings, they're available to us because the great masters of the past and present have insight into the nature of reality. And then they also see how one could navigate their way out of delusion. And that's no small matter. That's so huge that I don't even, what do you say about such a thing? Of course, it takes a while to understand the gravity of that actual idea. But for me, it just leaves me in a state of awe. And the more I study the Dharma, the more I see how brilliant it is. It's like I'm constantly astounded by the brilliance of the teachings and the path and how powerful it can be. And particularly then how we embody the path is through the 3 wisdoms of hearing, contemplation, and meditation. Bringing it to life in our own experience, which then has to do with the Dharma of realization, how we bring it to life, living Dharma. And we've talked a lot this week about how or these past couple of days about faithfulness and faithfulness to words and texts and so on. But I think the greatest expression of respect we can have for scriptural dharma is to actually bring it to life in our experience. And what that looks like, it can look many different ways. But because it can look many different ways, I think we have to be clear on how we poise our mind for insight. And that, to me, again, comes back to this place of inquiry where you're not grasping and rejecting. And this has to become very clear, I feel, as for the practitioner. So I think I want to just share one experience and then we can move on. I had an experience early on when I was in my early 20s, the first time I met Dogo Khyentse Rinpoche, that helped me understand this just in a very basic way, because I didn't really have vocabulary to explain anything, or I didn't have many teachings under my belt or practice experience. But I remember when I went to see him, I must have been like 22 years old, and I heard so much about him. And when I walked into the room, I saw this, well, first of all, physically astounding being, because he was so huge and so luminous. But the thing that struck me most was that he seemed to be amazed by life. And what this meant to me was that he wasn't grasping onto views. Now, I didn't have that understanding, and I hadn't encountered Nagarjuna so much. But when I project back, I understand what Nagarjuna was saying, because he was like the living embodiment of someone who's not grasping onto any kind of philosophical views or any kind of is or is not, the kind of subtle misunderstandings we have about who we are in relationship to everything around us. So there was that with him. But then on the other hand, when I looked at him, I could see that he had gone through this incredible process of refinement, which is the path, and that it had transformed him, every cell of his body. And it was like every cell was like dancing or juicy. I think some of you must know what I mean when I say this, because the lamas have that. And then he always smelled like milk. And other people noticed this independently of me. He smelled like milk, and he was so glorious to behold and be around. And I realized at that time, this is where the path must lead. And that is continued to be my ongoing reference point for my path. And so I can't say that's where I am at all. I understand this, we can call it the middle way of being. This place of inquiry, this openness, but it's open, but it's completely connected. It's the mind of an open question. That I like to use that phrase, because an open question is, it hasn't shut down around what is or isn't, but it's completely engaged with life. And so that reminds me so much of Rinpoche and his that first meeting and all the meetings that followed with him. So, I really have such faith that if one practices the Dharma authentically and also really respects the intricacies, the brilliant intricacies of the path and how it unfolds, then Dharma can always be relevant. It can be relevant in any time, in any situation, for anyone. I have great faith and great trust in that. And also, that's been my own personal experience. So that's that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm grateful that my nervousness at having to speak now is infused by the happiness I feel at being able to be together with all of you. We had a great meeting yesterday at lunch where we all encouraged each other to be ourselves and to speak from our experience on this panel and to share with all of you here. So I'm happy to have the chance to do that. And I'm going to speak about one perspective on on transmission, which is such a, at the same time, complex and important topic. So just to offer one perspective, and I look forward to hearing how it resonates with you. From my own experience, from having had the good fortune to spend a lot of time with my own teacher, Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso Rinpoche, and then in the years subsequent to that. So it seems to me that we can agree that what is being transmitted is, maybe we could all agree in this room, the most powerful, profound, helpful descriptions of nothing less than the core of our being, what we actually are, what our nature actually is, the rikpa, the wisdom mind. And that wisdom mind is inseparable from love, unconditional love. And like with anything powerful and profound, it's important that we be careful with it. And so two specific teachings that the Buddha gave have felt helpful guides for this, for me recently, that I've kind of taken as open questions, as koans to keep in mind. One is the warning that if the Dharma becomes the poison, then there's no antidote. And then secondly, whatever teaching it is, the time it was given, the place, the audience, all need to be considered. So if we take that as an invitation to consider ourselves and our own relationship with the teachings, then I'd just like to offer the suggestion that it's helpful to consider our own pre-existing relationship with one aspect of this wisdom mind, which is love. Because while the love of Yeshe, of Rigpa, is unconditional, unbiased, non-judgmental, our own experiences with love from our own lives may have been quite different from that, quite conditional. And because of the power of love, because of the fact that from the time we're an infant, it's a vital necessity. Research has shown that if infants aren't held, their health suffers, they suffer much greater mortality rates. So for us as human beings, love has been something important to us from the beginning of our lives, and part of what we do growing up is try to get it, try to establish relationship with our caregivers, whoever that might be, to nurture us, to reaffirm us, to help give us a model for how to live in the world. And how that process for each one of us, which is different, has individually shaped us, is something that we internalize and can become unconscious, but nevertheless still have profound effect on us and how we relate with our Dharma practice. So I just have 3 examples of how this might happen. One might be if it might have happened that we were brought up in a family where the way that we got love was to take care of others in the family at the sacrifice of our own needs. Bringing that unconsciously to Buddhist practice is going to make the Bodhisattva path feel like we're right at home. Or if in our family the way that we got acceptance and approval was to be tough and strong and not express emotional distress, then the Buddhist teachings on ego clinging, and anytime we use the first person or relate with emotions, then that's just the storyline and it's all empty, and that's going to feel like, yeah, that's right. Or if we've internalized the voice of criticism so that internally we have a strong self-critical voice happening, then the explanations about how all of our experience is confused, deluded, we're mired in ignorance and have to practice for lifetimes in order to hope to have a glimpse of what the lamas have, is going to make sense. So the problem is that we can practice in this way that seems to make sense to us, but if the underlying need or wound is never cared for, then what ends up happening is we still feel pain. And thinking we have to just keep practicing while something seems to be pulling us away from our practice while we're struggling to stay with it, is what ends up happening a lot of times. But in contrast, if we can bring this pre-existing relationship with love that we have into awareness from marikpa to rikpa, and we can bring consciously unconditional, non-judgmental, loving acceptance to this place inside of us, then transmission can be so powerful, transformative in a way that we experience it as complete. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts about it.
Thank you.
I was somewhat shocked and rattled by the previous panel. So I'm still coursing through my body. Feeling very moved at the moment by being with you and kind of bringing the discussion into a realm of our love and appreciation of the Dharma teachings. I feel a lack of bravado that I really appreciate right now at the moment. So I really appreciate Tsadra and want to thank Tsadra and everyone for putting on this conference. I find it very confrontational and uncomfortable. And I think it's important, like you're saying, to embrace discomfort and walk toward things that I wouldn't normally go towards. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate the invitation to speak on transmission, which I find to be a very important topic. And I also appreciate all of you. I know this is the last panel of the day, and it's very heady stuff here, so thank you for your attention. And I'll just start with my motivation. I hope that what I have to say can be helpful and beneficial in some way. I'd first like to define what I mean by transmission, personally. So what differentiates transmission from any kind of communication? While there is a transference of ideas or feelings from one party to another in transmission, I would say in addition, there is either the seed of transformation or an actual transformation that occurs. So I would say what separates transmission from ordinary communication is a transformative quality. In my circles, when the conversation is around transmission of the Dharma in the West, the conversation readily turns to what needs to change in the transmission to suit the dispositions of Western people. Like, how can the Dharma, come into Western minds? And what really interests me is what needs to stay the same. What is brilliant and highly effective in the transmission as it already exists, and what is worth preserving. So personally, one aspect is a ritual. Now, I hear a lot of things that, I don't know about other European places, but Americans have a disinterest in ritual, and we just want the essence of the teachings. So I would just like to say, I think as Westerners, especially, we need ritual. Our systems are so amped up, and our minds are so frenetic, that we really need to be guided through steps that place our system in a proper position to receive something profound, to receive something authentic. And I think it is ritual which provides those guiding steps. So it could be the ritual of a tantric empowerment. It could be the ritual of a reading transmission. I even think of the ritual of an oral teaching, where we begin with 3 prostrations before we take our seat. The teacher invokes the lineage, and we begin with opening prayers. That's a kind of ritual. So I interpret for Tulku Sangak Rinpoche, and he sometimes gives public talks. So that's like a talk, like on compassion, or how to deal with our emotions in the modern age, or something like that, where anyone can come in off the street. They don't have to be a Dharma practitioner. And so the format is different, and the ritual is foregone. And Rinpoche explained to me recently that he was dissatisfied with the way he was presenting the teachings in these public talks. And he thought it was because he wasn't actually invoking the lineage. And that this invocation was something that transformed his mind, that allowed his, recalibrated his system and oriented it in a proper place to allow the Dharma, the stream of blessings, to flow through him as the teacher. I find that a very valuable glimpse or example. Another example is, this is a little heretical, and you can berate me in the hallway for my lack of pure perception. But, sometimes it feels like I'm just hanging out with a guy, right? So just like some Tibetan guy, and he's on his phone, he's on WeChat, and we need coffee, and But then when it comes time for the empowerment, for example, and the ritual ablution has been done, the space has been cleansed by offering the torma to the obstructors. When Rinpoche puts on that hat and begins explaining the context of the empowerment, the history, who the masters were, and why this is important, we're no longer in an ordinary realm. And I'm no longer hanging out with a guy. something tangible, actually. Something has shifted, and we're all in the presence of something important. So in this idea that transmission is transformative, I'd like to make the distinction between the process of personal transformation and the transmission of techniques. So what I mean is, for the Dharma to work, for the transformation to occur, the process has to be highly personal. It has to be intensely relevant. I need to unravel my personal knots, the configurations, my parental patterns, the places of physical, emotional storage in my body, the tendencies of my own thoughts. And that takes a degree of experimentation and personalizing, what I've received. But I think that someone is qualified to offer a transmission once a degree of transformation has already occurred. And in that case, there's a certain reverence for the technique that afforded that transformation, and a desire to pass on the technique as I received it, in the hope that the recipient also will transform. So there's a little bit of a difference between my own personal transformation and the technique that allowed that transformation to occur. So when I was in retreat, I spoke to my lamas about the yogic exercises, and if I did it this way, this experience occurred. And they said, that's wonderful, then you should do it that way in your cabin. But you should also remember the way that we taught you so that you can teach others. So I realized then that there's a distinction that we shouldn't conflate. There's my own personal experience, but then there's this sort of transmission as it's been passed down the line that deserves to be preserved. I think in America particularly, we're really obsessed with our own story, and this is a protective measure. This protects the transmission from, I want to say, like personality disorders. And so I just, on this line, just want to say about lineage, that it's crucial in transmission. I think lineage reminds us where we've been, and it also points to where we're going. So when we invoke the lineage, when we remember the masters in the line of succession that landed on our labs, this contextualizes what we're doing and reminds us of its profundity, its sanctity. But then it also, the lineage masters, the root lamas, they're also embodiments of the fruition we're walking toward. So I would like to highlight the importance of lineage in transmission. Then I had other points about translation, but I think we've been really translation heavy, so if you want to ask me, you can.
Thank you.
I was about to speak from the perspective of a translator, but then with the way you ended your talk, I felt a little bit. Well, first, I'd say I really thank you for sharing about your experience about teaching the Dharma, because I really admire your courage for doing it, because it's really something that I don't have. And there's a book that early on when I started with Dharma, that just the title really impressed me. It was Tuko Ogyen, and it's called Repeating the Words of the Buddha. And I thought, he's a great master, why does he need to repeat the words of the Buddha? And then later on, I heard that Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche used to say that he was not a good teacher. He couldn't really teach, because when he teach, he would make each point by quoting 2 or 3 sources and then kind of explaining in his own words what those 3 sources meant. Whereas his teacher, like Shishin Gyaltsap or Gyurme Khyentse Chokyi would quote 30, 40, 50 different sources without adding any word of their own. And that's why he called a good teacher. And so that's why, I don't feel like I can... I just stay with translation, because then he says it, and then in the next minute you translate the word, and you don't have time to kind of to forget what was said. But because when we talk about transmission, it's like, what is it that we're transmitting? We are transmitting the words of the Buddha, right? The teachings of the Buddha, Tukugyen, or the title of the book. I don't know if Tukugyen said that or just the publisher. But that's it's very relevant, isn't it? That it's the teachings of the Buddha Dharma. Now, if I come and I explain, and I think you said that really very nicely, Sarah, from your own experience. If I start to talk from my own, put in my own things, then that would be my Dharma. That wouldn't be the Buddha Dharma. So the Buddha Dharma is it's repeating the words of the Buddha. And one time, like that, somebody asked me a question, and I quoted from Nagarjuna. I completely forgot what the quote was then, and probably I just had read it. But so I quote from Nagarjuna, and then the face of that person really, opens up, lights up, and I had the feeling that they really understood what Nagarjuna said, when I did not. I was a bit, jealous and frustrated when I just saw that they really got it, and I did not. But it really taught me something also about how, faithful you need to be with the Dharma, and you give that. And who was it? Wilson was saying that, probably, most probably we're just translating, hoping that people who are more, ready than us, more gifted than us, with have the dispositions to really understand and deepen that understanding, that or realize the teachings, would do it. So that's a little bit the purpose. So, and the translator, you're exposed to that from time to time when an advanced practitioner goes to a lama and they ask you to translate, and they both know what they're talking about, and you're the one who's supposed to kind of link between the two, and you're not quite sure what they're talking about and what they, and you have to sort of, because you don't have that kind of experience, you're not at that level, but still you need to, and somehow it works, that the student seems satisfied most of the time with the answers they get. So that's the idea of the transmission. That faithfulness is really something that I don't know. Maybe I get a bit obsessive with that, and then and so it makes me wonder how you can kind of bring the teachings and when you teach also how much transformation. And I agree with Sarah also. Each time we talk about teaching, and when I see people who become instructors or teachers, then the first thing they talk about is what they're going to do different. As if, the great masters who came, like Trungpa Rinpoche and others, were not able to do so. I'm going to do that. And like one of the things I've heard a number of times is like we shouldn't talk about the haram to Westerners because they don't like that, and just avoid that. And this is actually I read in a sutra, and I forgot the title. I just remember it starts with the D, which is not very helpful, but in which that's the problem of reading on computers. When you have the book, you can go back to you know where you put it, but with all the files on the computer, I don't even know if it was online or. But anyway, there the Bodhisattvas goes to the Buddha. So the Bodhisattvas were probably Indians, and they go to the Buddha and they say, we really appreciate everything you do for us, but can you start talk a bit less about the haram and all those negative things, and because really we can't relate to that. And the Buddha said, that's reality. What else? It's just being honest with you. So even the Indians couldn't take it, and I don't think the Tibetans have their own sort of it's part of their culture, so they have their own mechanism for kind of not hearing it so much. It's a little bit. Now, what makes me say that is I think it's from the Catholic also in France, all the monks who prepare wines and all the different kinds of alcohol and food and things like that, they really enjoy life. It's supposed to be a renunciate, but they have that way of kind of, not completely hearing it, not as much as the Protestant would, It's not quite as strict there. So to come back to the transmission, so there's those two aspects, that we know of. There's the transmission of the scriptures, so which is acquiring the knowledge of the teachings, and then that the Dharma transmission of the Dharma of realization. So when you transmit those two aspects, you transmit the teaching. Dharma of realization would be, I suppose, what Sarah was talking about, this transformation that happens, that realization. And so it's two. They are distinguished because there are two different, slightly different approaches, though they may overlap sometimes. But in terms of the Dharma of transmission, I was for about 10 years. I translated in a small Tsadra we've had in Nepal, at Khenpo Namdrol's place, the Rigpa Tsadra, and then so I was translating there in the morning, and in the afternoon we had what we call the clarification. And the clarification was basically not like in traditional monastic setting where I would just repeat what the Khenpo said in the morning, but it was more helping Western students to relate to that traditional way of teaching. And so that brings back to also what you were saying of what we want to keep. And I think that often when the teacher or the people who come, and when we talk about bringing the Dharma to the West and talk about what we need to change in order to help Westerners relate more to the teachings, I've found from my experience from those 10 years that actually it was very rewarding. This is not something I would do. So what I would do would try to just help the people connect with these teachings. I'm thinking I was able to do it. So I'm surely not more intelligent than they are. I don't have, greater capacity. So if I can do it, they can do it. So it's just a matter of helping that process, and it worked. It worked quite well actually. And for example, to come back to the Hell Ram, one time we had this instructor who was doing those afternoon sessions, and he had a problem with that all the students in the class, they were teaching the Bodhicitta Avatara, and there were only 8 students in the class, but the 8 of them couldn't take the haram. He had a problem with that, so he had to go and talk to them individually to help them. And so I told him that probably there's something that you were not doing right in those clarification sessions. You didn't help them to connect with that. He says, no, it's just it doesn't work with us, with the Westerners. And what I discovered after talking with the Khenpo the next year is that they had big argument about the existence of the Hell Ram. He was a scientist by trade, and so he strongly held those strong scientific views, in which it was very difficult for him to accept that there were worlds that you couldn't see. The basic how do you say? Forgot the word, axiom, or the science starts on external reality exists. Only thing that we know is that what we can see is what exists. So that was his view, and therefore the haram that we can't see, pretaram and all that didn't make sense. He couldn't accept that, and therefore he was not able to transmit that to the students. And he went on talking about how we should take out we shouldn't talk about the haram, but what I point out to him is that if you don't talk about the haram and all these teachings on the suffering of samsara, shortcomings of samsara, you don't bring in the fear. If you don't bring in the fear, then you can't take refuge, which is based on fear, right? You ask for protection against fear, and that also another time it was another group of people who were talking about that, also saying that, I never talk about fear, and I've practiced all my life without talking about fear. And that person who's done retreat for about 40 years, I heard a Lama saying, when I was saying that to a Lama who knows the person quite well, he says, yeah, no wonder that nothing happened, despite all the retreats. So I won't give any names. But the point is that this is the basis. So of course in the West we don't like to talk about fear, about all these things, but then if you don't do it, then you can't take refuge. Means this is not Buddhism you're doing, right? This is this is the difference between a Buddhist and a non-Buddhist, is somebody's taking refuge or not. So all this in the transformation is very difficult. And I think the more helping people relate to these teachings, the way we've made the effort, and very often there's not so much. We don't need too much, but there's a little bit, and especially in the traditional Tsadra context, where the Khenpos are very traditionally trained, and they have a way of sharing the teachings that can put off people. So it's necessary to kind of translate the culture, not just translate the word, but translate the culture. So that's for the Dharma of transmission, which is acquiring the knowledge. But then when it comes to the Dharma of realization, the thing that seemed to be really important is the one-to-one kind of relationship that you have with the teacher, and that seemed to be lacking in the West often for many people. You see that also as a translator. As a translator, you have that unique relationship with the Lama you're translating for, and so you receive that constant care, and you can see how that is really helps you to transform yourself and to start to integrate the teachings that you've learned through the Dharma of transmission. But you also see people come to see the teachers who have no personal relationship with any teacher. They just go to public talks, public teachings, and they are, you just go on the internet and then you find public teachings. And I heard that in Boulder, it's happening all the time. A friend of mine who's here, I think, but I won't name, also said that in Boulder it's almost obscene the way that the lamas come and like rock stars, with like the bus, the rock stars, they come with the bus of people who come and set it up before for them, and the whole team, and it's a little bit like that, he said. I don't know, it's the first time for me here. I've been here 2 days, I haven't seen anything like that, just quoting here. But so and there's a large number of people who relate to of Western people who relate to the teachings in the Buddha Dharma in this way. Just go to public talks and never get to have that sort of personal relationship that I found in my own experience was invaluable. It was after years, I studied Madhyamika for a couple of years, and then go to see Ogyen Tobgya Rinpoche, for whom I've translated some time, and then so I go into his room quite shy, and he's quite intimidating, and then he didn't invite me to sit, so I just stand there, and then he stands up, walks up to me, and looks at me and say, "You're weird. You're really weird." And then he walks out to his bathroom. He has a big, really huge room, and he walks out to his bathroom, and then I don't know what he's doing in there, and I'm just standing there. He didn't tell me to sit, so I'm just standing there, and he told me that, and I'm just thinking about that, and feel like, what did I do? What was that about? For like 5 minutes. Then he walks back and said, "You didn't like when I told you that." And so I tried to be a bit smart and said, "Well, that depends if you mean it or not." He said, No. You didn't like it, right? I said, "Yeah, I didn't like when people tell me these kind of things." That's right. He says, "So where's your Madhyamika?" You study that for years, you debate on that, and then, where is it? It's just words, right? Words are empty. So, and that was, when I thought, all this Madhyamika that I've learned, actually I need to apply that to myself. It hadn't occurred to me before. You need that personal kind of, contact to integrate the teaching, so that in terms of the transmission of the Dharma of realization, then you need that, so that it's like what you were saying, this personal thing that works for you, and then so that it's just you have to adapt to each individual a little bit the teaching for it to work. And so I'm just wondering about how is that happening. And I think Ari was saying yesterday that you have, like, when you teach, you have one-to-one interview with the students. So I found that really inspiring to hear that this is happening. So it was just a reflection on transmission, and when we talk about transmission and translation, so to me it's just there's not so much to say about that. It's more a question, like I was just throwing it out there, and asking what is the role of a translator now? Like when you go out of this room and you see all the books that are on the table, and it's a fraction of what exists in English now. what more do we need to translate? Of course, we can translate the Namgyel, for example, but or the Kangjur and translate everything. But at the same time, so much has been translated already. Oral translation also. Most teachers now speak English better than I do. So what is the next step? And I'm asking that also because I met somebody in Bulgaria in January who was a practitioner, and he came to me and then said, for us practitioners, a certain number of translations that we'd like to see and to have, but it's not happening. How could you translators do it? And that is, and when I tie that with what Shambhala sent me an email, I'm publishing a book with Shambhala, and so they want to make videos of all the authors now for their website, and they say, so there's two questions: what is the book about, and why did you choose to translate it? And I found that question incredibly shocking. Who am I to decide why I'm translating? It's like, what's the purpose of it? Of course, there's things I like, and it's helpful for me to translate it as a way of studying it. But at the same time, when we think about transmission of the Dharma to the West, to all the practitioners, then who am I to just decide to do this or that? That would be and it's sad to hear that the practitioners don't have much of a voice. Institutions might have, but then when you're just an average Dharma student in a Dharma center, you can go to a translator, but translators were quite important people, so we're not going to listen just to everyone. And so there's, that is also, part of the. So I was just wondering also how could we give a bit more of a voice to the end, to the customers, to the one who actually use those translations. So it was.
Thank you. So let's take some time and let the four of you sort of ask each other questions.
I just wanted to speak to something you mentioned. I think you quoted me as saying, so we shouldn't change anything in the transmission. So I just want to say, I don't know, but that's what I wrote down.
Okay.
So I just want to say, I don't think that nothing needs to change. I think there are many cultural problems.
Happy to send it out.
Karma Lecce Tsomo speaks really eloquently about gender, for example. I think there are cultural barriers that impede a person from receiving the immediacy of a transmission, and they should be separated from the authentic or the essential aspects of a transmission. I do want to voice that. And I think one of the big ones is language, and I'm a translator. And like my vision of a wonderful moment would be a fully trained Western woman is bestowing an empowerment with all of the rituals complete. It's an elaborate empowerment. It's 2 days. And she knows every single aspect of the ritual. And she's giving the entire thing in English to English speakers. So for me, that would be a very wonderful moment.
Hear, hear.
Just just add to you said. So might have said that nothing needs to change, but I agree with you. So that of course, we need to translate the word, but also translate the culture. But which is just that it's a very risky business, basically, to do that.
To change the culture of the Dharma.
Yeah.
Or of the,
I mean, the thing is, I think is this debate of how you, and the thing is, Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche is one of the main kind of persons who speaks about that. How you need to take all the Tibetan things out of the Dharma, but how do you do that? The Tibetan culture is so mixed with the Dharma, so you can say offering a kata is a Tibetan thing, so you take it out. You could. There's symbolism of representing the whiteness of the kata, representing purity of your mind. Maybe you could, but there's some other things which are much more. It's much more difficult. You need to know the culture and the Dharma so well to be able to have that confidence to say, oh, this is Dharma and this is not Dharma.
But I would say, and then I hope you to enter the conversation, that For example, I also did something similar to you in the, what did you call it, the like tutorial sessions. Tuku Sangak Rinpoche offered the Yeshe Lama in a 5-year program. And on year 4, it was the Trekchut section. And if you know this text, it's very dense. I know we think Trekchut should be like beautiful and spacious, and it is, but it's also extremely intellectual. And the students were having a hard time connecting with the text. We're having a hard time connecting where is Trekchut in this analytical section. And so I also did a, when Rinpoche said this morning, what he means is this. Do you understand that? Oh, okay. And then they got to ask questions, and there was an interface. And I think that's the beginning of unpacking culture from Dharma. So Rinpoche maybe didn't know, for example, that a certain moment would be a challenging intellectual concept, or he's received it so many times that it just like flows through him quickly, and then he didn't slow down. Or maybe not the culture in terms of he's a Tibetan person in America, but the culture of giving a teaching and what does it mean to receive it.
Elizabeth?
Well, I want to say I appreciate so much your kind of allegiance or faithfulness or respect for the Dharma as it is. And this is an interesting question that we're talking about. It's like, what do you change? I mean, in a sense, you know, it comes up in relationship a lot, because you can't help but respond if you see that somebody misunderstands something. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of just a natural responsiveness, I think. That's what teaching is, or helping is, or just helping someone is. And it just comes out naturally, because sometimes I see also in the culture there's just very small misunderstandings around words, or again, a lot of rejection, you know? That's the one that's most interesting to me, that's just wanting to immediately reject. Like the hell realm thing is very interesting, because it's not really, actually, ultimately speaking, to understand the hell realm, it's just as illusory as everything else. But it feels very solid for people. So sometimes I think it's just good for people to just rest with the discomfort of it. They don't have to buy it or swallow it or turn it into a belief system, because that's actually not even really the Dharma, but to not reject, you know? Again, there's that kind of inquisitive or that open questioning mind that's so protective. It protects the Dharma, but it also allows the practitioner to let whatever touch them unfold. You know, you can't hold the Dharma tight. You can't protect it that way, because once any kind of idea or concept touches an individual consciousness, it becomes kind of rambunctious, or it enters a new culture. It's like you can't control this. It has to come to life in its own way. And that's a beautiful thing. And sometimes it falls flat, and sometimes it flourishes, and sometimes it's misunderstood, and that's just what's going to happen. You know, life is not a resolvable situation. You know, that's samsara. You know, it's not something to be fixed, not because it's broken, but because things arise interdependently from the nature of emptiness, and it's going to move. So, in a certain way, it's such an interesting thing, because we really we're not in command, but we have to respond. And I find this it's like the Bodhisattva's dilemma. You know, how to live in that predicament requires a very big mind.
I find educating oneself about what the Dharma actually says to be really important in this responsive quality. So, for example, in the hell realms, the Hinayana, so Jigme Lingpa states very clearly in the Treasury of Precious Qualities, the Hinayana view is that hell is a real place under Dorje Den, under Bodhgaya. The Mahayana says that the hell realm is a mental state, a state of anguish or suffering created by klesha. So if we are educated, then these kind of problems sort of resolve a lot of time.
Yeah, it changes throughout the progression of the path so much.
The path is presented differently for different individuals.
I feel pretty ready to hear from all our people out here. I just say that I also really appreciate your your devotion to Dharma, and kind of bringing in, Elizabeth, what you were talking about, sort of the open mind. I hope that also within that there's room for what was mentioned in the first session of the dark night of the soul. I think there is in Buddhism, we have the stories of Virwapa throwing his mala into the latrine when his meditation on Havadra wasn't going well, or a Sangha giving up his meditation and leaving his cave. And so there is that. Those guys always just happen to get rescued by a deity, pretty soon after. So, but just to have room for that as well feels important. When you can just have that time when you just think it's all full of shit.
Yeah, doubt.
And that there's still room for that within that. That also is not something that is to be rejected.
These are the most interesting things,
Yeah.
in my opinion. I'm very fascinated with doubt. I've had a rough and gritty path, as well as it's been extraordinary. But these places where we feel like we're supposed to be like the poster girl for the Dharma or something, or poster, you know what I mean? But actually, these more difficult experiences for me, like that's where I always target, and I love to share that with people, and I feel like I want to look at those myself, because unless you look in those places, you can't progress at all on this path. It has to be inclusive, I always noticed in retreat, when I first went into my longer retreat, it's like I would allow myself to experience maybe 10% of my experience felt comfortable to myself. It was like I couldn't, there's so much rejection and grasping. But then after a while, 20%, 30%. Sometimes you felt like, bring it on, because your mind was relaxed and you weren't pushing against it, like you had that open, inquisitive. Inquisitive sounds like even too light for what it is. It's like you allow yourself to actually have an experience without putting a lid on it or repressing it or rejecting it or making it into something. That's a very profound, that's what the Dharma is supposed to do, actually. So I think this darkness is fascinating to me. And it should be, because we're supposed to delight in uncomfortable things about our mind. If you don't look at your mind and you don't look at your own obscurations, then you're just living around them, and then you're just going to be like how you always are in samsara, picking and choosing everything, what you like and what you don't, and all the preferences, or can it prevent you from any kind of transformation, right? So, maybe we should open it.
Yeah, wonderful. So please just raise your hand, and the 2 mics going around.
Thank you so much for this wonderful session. My question is, well, let me give a little context first. I work a lot with college students and millennials, and you're much closer to millennials than I am. And the studies are showing that millennials are extremely hesitant to join organizations, religious institutions, and to make a commitment. And I have a lot of contact with mindfulness movement, people who want to practice, but they don't want any kind of roots or tradition or commitment. And I'm wondering what, Elizabeth addressed this a little bit at the very beginning, but I'm wondering how you, in your seats as teachers, are relating to this phenomenon when you go around and teach of enormous hesitation and a very strong feeling among many young people that there's no need for lineage, there's no need for commitment, no need for really just give me the technique, teach me how to do it, and let me go off on my own. And I'll go to a meditation studio, or I'll do a podcast, but none of the the kinds of things that I certainly have always felt crucial in my own life as a practitioner.
Yeah, that's a great question. The teachers can answer.
Yeah, to me, encountering that, which I certainly have, I think I personally try to keep in mind, like what Elizabeth mentioned, of just the open mind, because I can bring to it my own strong thought of how important community is and how beneficial it is. But if I can't meet that individual somewhere, then I don't have a chance. So where can I meet them? And if that means that they'll come and participate more, then great. And if it means that they won't, then I've met them somewhere. And I do believe that that has an effect. I mean, it does for me, if I can have that experience of meeting them. And my hope is that it will for them too in some way. So I still have hope.
Maybe I'll try to say something, although that's a question I have myself. So, there's always going to be Dharma for the masses, and then there's going to be Dharma for more serious practitioners. So I just kind of constantly remind myself that, even though I find working with the teacher is, personally for me, I can't even imagine what it would be like without that and without a lineage. And it's so powerful, these traditions that we're all a part of. But I'm happy that Dharma is spreading in a certain way in the way it is. And I think a lot of it is just karmic. I want to, like Ari's saying, when I'm in a situation to try to explain things and open up words and ideas, I really try to do it. The word religion and the word faith and the word devotion and guru, these are almost like bad words now, somewhat in our culture. I just finished my book on the logic of faith because I notice that people have a lot of trouble with that word faith and associate it with dogma and, institutional religions and all that. But when you look it up in the dictionary, it has so many incredible meanings. And I think, language has become entrenched in certain belief systems too. But there's a lot of reasons why somebody wouldn't want to join an organized religion or take on a guru. Let's face it, And so these things actually have to be addressed. I'm not even sure if they've been completely addressed. And so that again points to talking about some darker things or having the courage and also the container to be able to talk about these things these are big topics.
I'd like to add that millennials, while it's true there's a hesitance and a kind of sarcastic stance about institutions, I think there's a lot of wonderful qualities. I think millennials, as a huge stereotype, are really can tell when something's true. Mm-hmm. They don't take shit. And I think that's a great place to meet the Dharma.
So I'm thinking of a couple of key themes. And one is Dharma as prescriptive. And a lot of Westerners see Dharma as prescriptive, and it is prescriptive. And I don't remember your name, but you alluded to, Westerners in many respects wish to find Dharma and as an individual practice that they can go to and get the practice and take it away and not relate to a teacher. So that's one issue. It's sort of Dharma as prescription. And the other is self-exploration. And I heard at least a few voices on the stage that I think are very, very Western influenced in terms of the significance of knowing what is occurring with oneself when one takes on prescriptive behaviors. And my experience as a Dharma teacher is that many people who come to the Dharma are looking for a kind of cookbook to feel better. It takes a lot of work to create a frame of a traditional Dharma motivational situation. Within that, what often occurs is people get turned off and they don't have any experience or knowledge of self-exploration, and they disappear. And so the question I'm wondering if you could maybe just think aloud with me about is that these disappearers who we don't, how do we create a culture within the Dharma world where we actually do encourage this kind of self-exploration that was described, where people don't see it as just an act of prescriptive, you do this, and when then the person has trouble with the doing this, they just disappear because it didn't work or they feel bad about themselves, and this is just another example of me failing at something. But they see the process of Dharma is both prescriptive, but also as a kind of long-term process of self-exploration. How do we create that kind of culture where people just don't come to, what is it like in the words of my perfect teacher, the person who's looking for the musk from the deer and sort of then runs away because they got the musk, but actually can stay in there and hang in there with that whole attempt at both learning what to do, but also appreciating that there are these experiences that are valuable in the doing, even though some of those experiences are not what they think they should be experiencing.
Well, I've thought a lot about that one, so I'm just going to say something brief, which is how important it feels to me to move the locus of our emphasis from the teaching as something to get right to what is your experience of this teaching. So I'm giving a meditation instruction, and my primary interest is in what's the person's experience. And to hold that experience as authentic and therefore valuable because it's their experience. Whether they might be feeling it's right, wrong, criticizing themselves, thinking they did it well, whatever it is, that experience is valid because it's their authentic experience. And if we can sort of create that kind of space, some people are always going to shy away from it, but it seems to me then we have the best chance of attracting people because it can feel like they're like Elizabeth was talking about, they're not excluded in any way internally, so they don't suffer that.
That's great.
Yeah, I'd like to just put an exclamation point on what Ari said about really it's an issue of cultural translation, is it not? You know, meeting students where they are and not where we are. And that's really where transmission takes place. So cultural translation is not an issue just east and west, it's a generational issue. And to me, that's the definition of upaya, is not meeting people where they are, not where we are. And for me, the archetype of that was, you know, Trungpa Rinpoche. I mean, he didn't come in and talk above, he stooped down, so to speak, to meet us at eye level, adapted our cultural norms, and then he, so to speak, stood up. But because we're able to see someone like that eye to eye, you fall in love with someone like that, they stand up, you stand up with them. So I think the ability to really open and listen and really tune in where the other person is at. So I just wanted to say something about that. But the other thing that I'd like to hear more about is this, underlying meta-narrative of how you all wrestle, work, play with the challenge of maintaining allegiance to the tradition, to the practices, and yet making these practices your own. Because for me, an extended retreat, I always ask myself a question when I'm engaging in a new practice: what does it mean for me to accomplish this practice, for instance? And so if I don't make these experiences and these teachings personal, they don't reach me that way. But so I'd like to hear more from you or anybody else in the group about how they wrestle with this balance between allegiance and adaptation, editing.
I think I said that before I actually knew what I was going to say. But it's like I'm on the verge of saying something. Because it's a really good question.
I can jump in.
What?
Oh, yeah, please.
Okay, no.
You found it. I saw. You
Okay.
found it at the end.
The three wisdoms is a big piece of this. And I think it becomes personal the moment it hits your awareness. At least for me, you hear the Dharma and immediately there's some change, or it falls flat. But if you're a practitioner, that's what happens. And contemplation then is taking the Dharma and looking at it through your own personal experience. And that includes looking at really difficult things. And then when you meditate, you're having a direct experience of something. So, I think the system itself actually is what takes care of that. If you follow the Dharma precisely, but not, I don't know, somehow for me the Dharma hasn't felt, it has felt prescriptive at times, but then I feel like the Dharma is not alive in me, and that bothers me. So I start to look at how it is that I'm working with my mind in accordance with the teachings. So, the Dharma is meant to become personal. The Dharma is meant to come alive in you. So maybe it's not exactly answering your question, but I think we all struggle with this, and that's where you have to kind of do your work, or not you, but we all have to do our work and seeing what it is. For me, a lot of the times I notice there's grasping and rejecting involved. It's like we're having an experience and we don't want to have that experience, that we wish we were someone else somewhere else having a different experience. There's not this kind of curiosity or that really impedes a practice experience. I often ask myself in retreat the whole time. Actually, at first I was so concerned about my boundary and not crossing my boundary. Then I became to realize where is the boundary is like whether I'm actually practicing or not, whether the practice is alive in me or not. And that became a huge inquiry for me throughout my entire retreat. Like, when am I actually practicing and when am I not? Because you could sit there for hours, cross-legged in the most spiritual position and never practice at all. We all know that. And you can be out in the world and all of a sudden be connected. So I think more than anything, this is a question we have to continuously ask ourselves, because no one can really tell you what that is. That's something you have to find for yourself. And you'll never have confidence unless, there's nothing like the confidence that comes from seeing for yourself. So, I guess I really feel that's a question I always had to ask myself, really, ultimately, is how is it alive in me, and why isn't it? Or to be able to recognize, and it's very subtle, but it just comes from practicing and practicing and practicing. And finally, you start to habituate yourself to that kind of openness and ability to bear the fullness of life that you usually don't know how to relate to. We don't have a good relationship with our experience. For some weird reason, digesting experience, like ingesting, digesting, and eliminating, is food is easy, but there's something about experience, digesting experience, I always feel, why doesn't it come naturally to us? But we're always struggling with it. And the Dharma is instructive in that way. And then, but it takes practice, and it takes, diligence and a lot of watchfulness. Anyways, it's a good question.
Yeah, it's okay. I think there's lots of other questions.
I think I'm next.
Okay.
I was listening to the comments about people millennials not wanting to connect institutions, and you'll see that by extension, many want to watch lamas on the internet and not have any physical contact. But I immediately went to a place in myself, and I remembered there's a phrase from a prayer that we do. I can't remember what prayer it is. Seeing, hearing, remembering, and touching are 4 ways to connect. The Dharma is transmitted from the Lama. And only seeing and hearing, you're not smelling Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, you know. You're not feeling that warm magma that comes from our Lamas. And I start to cry, you know, remembering the Lama. For me, Vajrayana is very physical. And I'm wondering, as teachers, you know, we've focused so much in this conference on the wonderful textual tradition and accuracy and balancing poetics and accuracy and so forth. But what are you doing as teachers to pass on the nonverbal traditions that you inherited from your lineage lamas?
Hard to give a verbal answer to that one. But I find as I go on, I feel contact with my teacher in different ways. Like for me right now, one image that really kind of keeps coming up repeatedly is the way that Khenpo Rinpoche would walk through an airport. So slow. And I'd be like, I couldn't walk as slowly as him, you know, and it was like I'd be walking further ahead, and I'm like, come on, we got to get to the gate, you know, and he'd just be walking so slowly, and just like, it was like, but now I kind of like, particularly in this world where everything is so speedy, you know, it felt like he just embodied the sun, and everything was kind of revolving around him, and he just had no care, you know, like he would just walk through the airport at whatever rate he wanted to go at, and then I mean, like Gyurme talking about your experience with Organ and Namgyel. I remember one time the people were actually getting on the plane, and he wanted to go in the restaurant and have a beer and a hot dog, you know, and I was like, they're getting on the plane, Rinpoche. I mean, we gotta go. And he looked at me and he said, like, you coward. You know, you're just a coward. So, you know, so I think for me, it's just like, just all I can do is recall that and just kind of let it in, and then somehow hope that kind of will be communicated.
Can I push you a little bit on that? Maybe you mentioned a little bit about the guru, and you mentioned a little bit about that's problematic. But what is the guru function in the Vajrayana? Is the feel the guru offers us a chance to be devoted, you know, to feel that selflessness through just utter abandonment. And wow, that's very dangerous. So how do you, in this tradition, you know, and of course there's so much Orientalism, you know, the Tibetan, of course, is, you know, has this, but how could a Westerner do this? But how do we feel devotion to a young Western, you know, teacher? How do you take, that's a huge responsibility. Is that,
You're asking?
I'm asking all of you. I mean, how do you deal with that? Because there's an expectation in this tradition. No.
Well, I would caution any teacher from eliciting a certain response. I think that if we offer Dharma teachings, and I personally don't, I just translate them. This, as Ari just said, we remember our lamas and the way they affected us, and also the way the techniques of the teachings affected us. And then we simply, you know, pass that on. And each individual has their own set of responses. It's really not up to a teacher to say, you should feel devoted to me.
That's nice.
I think, having a teacher is not like taking someone as an ontological presence. It's a relationship, let me put it that way. So there's like an agreement that and this is why sometimes I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around the teacher. Like you see someone and you kind of feel something, and then there's kind of a deification of the teacher, which of course is dangerous, because then if the teacher does something that doesn't seem perfect, then the other thing happens. Like they become demonized or what have you. And I think, it's an agreement that you're going to utilize the relationship to wake up. And I think that's dangerous because perhaps the teacher might not have that understanding sometimes. I know I married my teacher, he was 21, and then we got married. And that was a really kind of interesting situation for me, but I'm still devoted to him more than ever, But I had to struggle so much in the marriage and in the, the whole thing, trying to figure out, what is the husband and what is the teacher, which really didn't work. Because I have made a commitment that I am going to take this human being as the relationship and utilize it in a particular way, and it's really worked. In the end, I figured it out, but it took me a while. I really struggled, like for many years, in many ways. And he is not an easy teacher to begin with. He's a challenging Lama, and I appreciate that very much now. But I've been crushed. In a good way, I mean. In a good way. It's been very profound for me. I really do think it's an agreement, but I have a concern that a lot of people don't understand what the agreement is. That's my biggest concern, that people come into the Vajrayana with a lot of fantasies. And it's an advanced practice. It's not an easy practice. It's a Vajrayana practice. So I do have concerns about this particular issue sometimes.
I'd like to modify your definition of devotion as total abandonment. I think that's dangerous. There are a lot of safeguards to proper devotion, like, for example, examining your teacher for a long period of time. I personally got really confused and experienced intense ramifications. When I came back from Nepal after being in retreat, I wanted to just connect back with my Dharma community, and my Lama's retreat cabin had been moved to, they made him a nicer one, so it had been moved. And anyway, I was sharing meals in this old one, and I misused a camping stove, and it exploded. And I had a flight reaction, but then I felt that this is my Lama's retreat cabin, and I need to put out this fire. And so I did. I entered bodily, and I had no physical concern for my own body.
Wow.
And it was a mistake. It was super brave, and it was super dumb. And I got third-degree burns on 17% of my body. And I was in the hospital for 5 weeks, and I had 4 surgeries. And I found this somatic trauma therapist, and she said, that's really rare that an individual overrides their survival instinct. She said that she's never actually met someone, because my instinct was to flee. Physically, that was my response. And I thought, well, yeah, I know you haven't met a Dharma practitioner. That's what I thought.
Wow.
And then she had to teach me, this is your physical boundary, your skin, and it's something to attend to and to take care of. Anyway, so I've had a reimagining of devotion where it feels less about total abandonment and like, I don't care if I die, and it's all for you, which I felt in every pore of my body. Like, it just didn't matter if I died. Now it feels more like I have a genuine reverence for the stream of blessings and the teachings itself and the moments that an individual is able to channel that. It's less about the human. I value the teachers and I serve them. There's a kind of sort of integrity that I find really valuable. I would especially like to say for women, that we don't lose our centers to the male teachers and we retain a degree of our own center. Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah. I think it's good she said that, because what I said previously might have sounded a little harsh, but actually for me it was great. I really want to make sure that that's understood, because I feel I really needed that to happen to me. I mean, it doesn't sound very logical in a way, but it was an empowering situation actually for me. I think it's perfect, but so I think it's good you said that, because it could be misunderstood. And I want to make sure that, and I know also my relationship with my teacher is very deep and very dear, and very tender also. But he just is a provocative, like he's very strong. And it's the marriage thing is was challenging. It is challenging in that way, but in a good way. So I want to make sure that that's because that could be actually careless to say that, because there are a lot of problems that also could come from it. Just in my case, it worked out well. So.
Thank you.
I have a question. So thank you for all of you. I'm a Tibetan. I have one question about Westerner Dharma teachers. So in Tibetan culture, we know a Lama, a Dharma teacher, a Khampo, they have to have more than 10 years monastic training. And some of them maybe more than 20 years. So practice and study the Yung Bodhinga, then they will become a Dharma teacher. So I have a question. What is the standard for Westerners to become Dharma teachers? Sorry, this is, I really want to know, because I have this question for a long time.
It's great. We're laughing just because it's a great question.
And we don't have the answer.
Well, I would say that even for Tibetans, there are khenpos, right? There are people in monastic institutions, and then there are people outside of them who sort of become empowered by their teachers to teach based on their experience. So even in the Tibetan model, there's different ways that people get to be teachers.
And sometimes your teacher just tells you what to do, so you do it. And you have to trust your teacher.
My name is Tulku Denzing Gyurme, and I'm from Sarajaya Monastery in South India. And I really want to thank you for sharing your really wonderful experience. And I have a few comments, actually, then a question. We discussed a lot about devotion and transmission. And of course, the devotion is a very complicated matter. So it can be really a very strong devotion. So I won't go detail into that. So my main concern is about the transmission. So in Vajrayana teaching, of course, the transmission is very important. And transmission, when I say transmission, I mean the lineage from your masters. And usually we bring our lineage all the way to the Buddha himself. And same is with the Pratimoksha vows and all those. But lineage is, I feel, in Vajrayana teachings, for example, when a master gives an empowerment or some special instructions, and if the students are able to completely follow and understand what the master is preaching, and able to what should I say, implicate and put it into practice and visualize at the same time. So that is what we refer to as receiving the initiation, the transmission. So I think, so transmission is about receiving, and lineage or transmission is about being able to understand and implicate or imply everything in your practice during the initiation. So it may be less to do with some physical thinking or some dreams or those things, So that may be secondary, I think. So just my few comments. And another one is, So, gentlemen, you have discussed about whether there is a future further need to translate more the Tibetan works into English, because we already have a lot of materials for practice. And I think that the purpose of translation is not a mere, the main purpose of translation is to preserve the knowledge that is present in these canons. And in 7th century and early in Tibet, when the Tibetan translators and the masters start to translate all the Indian great texts to Tibet at that time, I really doubt that we have enough really practitioners who understand all those, so it may be few at that time. So similarly in English, so it is where I think that the translators really, of course, the quality, and there are really many challenges in finding the right translations and those things, but I think that the translators have to work hard to be able to translate almost everything that is available in Tibetan material and Sanskrit into English. Because right now, of course, there are many masters at present in the Western world, and there are many brilliant students. I know personally many of them who are really studying in the great Tibetan monastic institutions in India and Nepal and all over the world. But in future also, these translations can really benefit a lot of people. So I think that translation has to continue. And sorry, I won't take long. I have only one more comment. This is very important, I think, about the culture and the teaching or the religion. And His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, whenever he teaches, he always tells the audience that we have to separate what is the culture practiced and what is the real teachings of the Buddhism. So sometimes if we get mixed up with these two, then a lot of confusion arises. So I think by small examples like offering kadak and those things, of course, when Buddhism came to Tibet, it started only around the 7th century. And before that, the Tibetan people already have an established culture and traditions. And arrival of Buddhism into Tibet will not be able to change that culture. So many cultures remain still after that. So it's very evident in Tibetan families. Nowadays, we have habit of hanging prayer flags and a lot of pujas and a lot of Naga pujas and deity pujas. Many of them are really culture-oriented rather than real practice. And so Western world has to really understand that. I think that's important. So other than that, the real teaching of the Buddhism, when you transfer into the Western, context, so the culture, there is nothing really different culture, the Tibetan presence of a different Tibetan culture in the translation of the Tibetan material that you have to reinvent or something. So that's my few comments. Thank you.
We don't have a lot of time, so do you want
I had a question, Jean-Paul? Okay.
A lot of time focusing backwards on our teachers and the lineage and tradition, and granted, this is all extremely important. But we're talking here about transmission, and transmissions means to pass something forward. And some kind of devotion to your students must also be important in that. And I wonder how you feel about your own devotion towards your students and those people for whom you're responsible in terms of helping them with their spiritual development. So maybe there's no time for you to discuss this, but I thought I would bring it up as an important point. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to say that as a translator. When I became a translator, I made a solemn promise to myself that I would not be one of these asshole translators that prevented students from gaining access to their teacher, because I had encountered that a lot. So I have a fierce kind of protective devotion. So even, for example, sometimes several Tibetans will be at a teaching, and then Rinpoche will just kind of fall into speaking Tibetan, and I'll be like, there's a lot of English speakers here who don't understand what you're saying, and they're going to feel left out. I always say they're going to feel left out because that's our American mode. And so, yeah, I feel protective of people as a translator.
We need to stop. I mean, I'm afraid that there are the shuttle buses going back to the hotel, so I have to cut off the conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.